Hi, welcome back to the Trial by Jennifer podcast series. My name is Jennifer Butterfield, and this week's guest is a former colleague of mine and friend, Megan Cook, formerly Megan McIntyre, and she is a Texas estate planning attorney and also recently just got married. Congratulations, Megan, and welcome to the show. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Jennifer. I have never been on a podcast before, so I'm super excited. My husband Joe does them all the time for different sports news outlets, so I feel like I need him here to tell me what I'm doing right and wrong, but thankfully he is not here tonight to see this. Um, he can watch it later on.
Yeah.
But again, my name is Meg Cook. I grew up in a small town in Mississippi, and then I came to Austin to study international relations at UT. I later got my law degree from Texas Tech, and I've been an attorney for about 5 years now.
I am really
Did you
excited
just
to
do the
have you.
guns up?
Yeah, Reckham, right? Isn't that the thing with tech? Yeah.
Yes. I feel like I affiliate more with UT. But yeah, so I moved back to Austin after shortly after law school. I've been focusing on estate planning and probate, but interestingly, I also have practiced consumer bankruptcy, which I
Cool.
think is kind of interesting for this podcast. But that's
I
another time.
I didn't even know that about you, but yeah, that is really interesting. Feel free, like, if there's
Yeah.
anything based on your experience. I know that wasn't like the focal point of the your guest appearance, but like if there's anything that you want to add that's relevant that comes to mind during the podcast, please feel free to include any of your responses with information about that. And I ask everybody on the podcast this question. I always like to start off with it because I think it's really kind of helps the audience members get like a more personalized view of the guests. And so I'm curious, what was the conversation around personal finance like in your home growing up?
So we did not really talk about money that much. If you can sort of understand growing up in Mississippi, there's definitely a little bit of a polite, what is polite and what is not, and talking about money is not polite. I think that a lot of other people have heard the same thing. But at the same time, my mom really wanted me to know that you should always try to live under, if not within your means. So always spend a lot less than you have. There was definitely a lot of emphasis around saving. And I think planning for, the what ifs in life and
Mhm.
making sure that you're not exhausting everything that you have, so that you're prepared for anything.
Mhm.
Um, I think my parents definitely ascribed to the, if you can't pay for something with cash, then don't,
Can't
you
afford
probably
it.
can't afford it.
Great.
So that was kind of the ideology, I think, um, about personal finance issues in my house.
No, I love it. Just in the brief summary that you gave me, you covered some of the like very first steps that I think are so important with personal finance, right? So living beneath the means and then creating an emergency savings fund, right? And then looking into like savings and investments beyond that. And so beautifully put. And I love that you had that foundation growing up. And thank you for sharing. It's so interesting because money really is like this taboo thing, right? That I feel like a lot of people, it's not talked about, and or it hasn't been in the past, And I think it like there is some like rudeness, right? Like to just go and ask somebody like, "Oh, like how much do you make?" or like this or that, how do you afford that? Like those are not like appropriate things to say. And I also think, like, with that, there is like an objective way with financial literacy to educate others. And it's always so interesting to me because everybody comes from a different background, regardless of where we are today. And I love that you had that like positive reinforcement with those healthy financial habits so early in life. It sounds like that's really important. Um, I know that, yeah, I mentioned earlier that you're a newlywed. Congratulations. I was so grateful to be invited to the wedding. And without going into detail regarding exact figures, I'm curious, can you share a little bit about the elements of planning your wedding that couples might want to consider in terms of like budgeting before getting engaged or even preparing to tie the knot?
Yeah, this is a tough question. I have a lot of different feelings about it. I would say either maybe not before you're engaged. Enjoy dating, and then get engaged. And then as soon as you get engaged, I would say the best thing to do is to sit down and start putting together a guest list. And that might actually be, a few different guest lists. So if you maybe try for a small, medium, and large wedding guest list and sort of have three different tiers. And start, because that really, how many guests you invite to your wedding really drives a lot of costs,
Mm-hmm.
um, just in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing to do soon after getting engaged for sure is talk to your team, whoever is helping you, um, with the costs of a wedding. Mine was my mom. And talk about what, obviously you're going to have to decide on a firm number about what is your budget. And that can be big picture, or it can be a little bit more detailed in terms of categorizing all the different costs, like how to allocate your budget. I personally found that to be really challenging, because I didn't know a lot of what things cost. So it was really hard to say from the start, okay, 5% of my budget is going to go to X category.
Right.
So that was kind of hard, but I think, there are different approaches, and it just depends on who, um, your personal style, as well as, the people who are helping you. So
Yeah.
just to circle back, like I was saying, there were different things that I placed a lot of value on that my mom didn't. And so we sort of had to balance, okay, mom, you really care about guest experience.
Right.
I really cared about photographs. So
Yep.
you kind of have to figure out a happy medium when you're deciding how to allocate, your costs. But yeah.
I love that. I mean, well, first of all, I've been wanting to interview a wedding planner for a while, and I know we had talked about me potentially interviewing yours. So, shameless shout out and plug. I would love to interview your wedding planner, but I think too it's so interesting because it's such a big expense, and I think like for my target audience, I work with like the millennial 25 to 45. A lot of them are women, or like, newly married couples, things like that. And it's always so fascinating to me. Because it really is such a personal choice. Like, what's important? What are the elements that, right, that take priority, right, over others? And I mean, I think a lot of people don't realize, before getting into a serious relationship, how how much weddings can cost, and so it's an investment, and I think it's up to the couple and families and things like that. But I'm really grateful for you sharing your experience, and I'm curious, what do you think was like the most unexpected expense out of planning for the wedding as a whole, like looking back on the whole experience?
So there are two things, and I do want to touch on what you said about the wedding planner. Best, I mean, hands down, best expense of the wedding. And I think this goes for a lot of the people who you're, like you said, your target audience. If you're working, you might want to consider. I really thought that I could do it on my own. I could plan this
Yeah.
wedding on my own. But at the end of the day, you can consider how much time it takes out of your day or over a period of time. All of that adds up. And the way
Mm,
I looked at it was, my bonus or my potential bonus depended on, me being present at work and putting in hours. And so I was like, okay, paying somebody else to do this, even though up front it seems like a lot of money. Oh, it was so worth it. That
yeah.
expertise and also just having somebody else who can be there for you and support you was so worth it. So I definitely think that cost is an it's a necessity.
Hmm.
Um, the unexpected costs, I really just didn't know how much things like paper products and the cake. I had no idea how much cakes cost, and
Oh
so
my gosh.
I also, yeah, I had no idea. They are so expensive, and mine was great. It was awesome. Would pay for it again, but it's really hard when you're filling out a questionnaire
Hmm.
and they ask for, what's your max budget for this cake, and I'm like, I don't know, what do people pay? So that
Right.
was hard. Um, and then I also decided that I really wanted some custom stamps. So I found a stamp collector and I way overpaid for the price of stamps. So those were maybe things that in hindsight I wish I would have been a little bit more careful about. But those were, I think, my two things that really stand out to me.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think this is probably one of the first in-depth conversations I've had about a wedding and the personal finance aspect of it. But I love that stamps were like you're all out. That's just it tickles me.
It was so silly. I mean, it was really cool. They looked really neat.
Yeah.
I had a magnolia for the state of Mississippi, and then I had a couple of different Texas kind of
Mhm.
like, I don't know if you would call them antique stamps, but they're collector's stamps. So
Yeah.
they don't sell them at the post office now, but they were pretty cool, and they made the envelope look really interesting.
Exciting to
But
open
they
the
did cost.
invitation. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, there's something really special about invitations, like being able to like get it in the mail. It's got your name. I mean, I think they call it snail mail, but I think that's one of the beautiful parts of weddings, like the tradition of sending out the invitation to your guests and like it coming and knowing that your friends are getting married and you're invited to come and it's a save the date, that the whole experience is really special. So kudos to you for going the extra mile with that. And yeah, like with cakes, it's like, where do you even begin? Like, I don't even know what number I would write like to start, but like, I guess that's where the planner comes in, right? Because you talk to them about what ranges
Exactly.
are. They're there for the questions, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
100%.
So I think this ties in perfectly because you are an estate planning attorney. And we talked a little bit about some of your background academically and how long you've been in practice, but can you share a little bit with the audience and myself a little bit about why you decided to become a lawyer?
Yeah, so I think that I had the skill set necessary,
Mm.
and I, I guess I enjoy communicating with people, and I think that that's a really crucial part of lawyering is you have to be able to communicate directly and, you know, in a way that you can achieve the objective that the client wants. Um, in terms of estate planning law, I really felt like it was a great practice area for me personally because um, they they get to meet with a broad range of clients. So older people is typically what you know people think about when they think of estate planning. They think about people who are, you know, much older, retirement age and beyond. But also a lot of younger people who are at the the beginning of their careers, and they are just married and they're trying to make sure that their ducks are in a row so that when things go maybe when things are unexpected, there's a plan in place. And I think it's really cool to be able to that, um, be part of that process in somebody's life and really be able to walk them through it. So I don't know if that fully answers your question,
Yeah.
but
Well, and I mean, just to kind of comment on what you've shared, I think too, it's like, um, first of all, yes, you have fantastic communication skills and are very detail oriented. And I genuinely appreciate that about you, and even like scheduling the podcast and things like that. I just felt like it was very easy to get um, things agreed upon. But I love this idea of helping people with that process, because especially with estate planning, I mean, it's like the last thing people want to think about, but it's so, 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 so important. And to have someone kind of there to hold their hand and walk them through the process. I mean, it's one of those things that like you never want to have to think about, but you need in place, and it's like it's that important, because the cost of not having it is far greater, right? So I'm curious, I've interviewed an estate planning attorney previously on the podcast, and she primarily works in employment law and is like in house at a company, but does estate planning on the side, and was more so focused on kind of end of life planning. Whereas I feel like there's somewhat of a contrast in the sense that like I know that you and the partner that you work with have a tendency to work with like new families, right? And I'm curious, what are some elements of estate planning that like a new couple or even a single person who's planning to get married or is engaged, or even like as people are starting to consider having children and growing a family, can you share a little bit about that?
yeah. So with our younger clients, I think a lot of them are surprised that they do need estate planning documents. As you mentioned, when you're young and you're healthy, you're really not thinking about what's going to happen to all the things that you own when you die. But there are other elements, especially if you are, you know, if you unfortunately have a short term disability or something like that, where you're unable to communicate what your wishes are for everyday finances or even medical care. Being unable to communicate with people can make your life a little bit more difficult, and especially for the people that you love, your family members, your partner, your children, not being able to tell them how you would like for things to be handled. That's kind of where we can come in and we can put those wishes in writing. And we can make sure that um, if, for example, if you become incapacitated, if you don't have anybody who has the authority to act on your behalf for your financial accounts, things like that, that could make bill pay pretty complicated if you are, if for some reason you're not, if you're single and maybe you split a lot of household expenses with your partner. Um, if something happens, they can't access your accounts. It can be such a headache and it can
Oh
be
my
really, really complicated, especially before you're married. Um, Having things like that. I know that before my husband and I got married, we didn't live together, so there wasn't any issue of like who owns the house, and that wasn't an issue. But we had dinner together every night, and we shared a lot of household expenses, and it was sort of just you know, we didn't have any agreement in writing, but if something had happened to me, he it's very possible that there were things that I needed to reimburse him for, but I didn't, or we had just kind of been sharing things, um,
right.
and not having him not having the ability to access my accounts and things like that could have made things really complicated. Um, I think also for people who've been living together for a while and they're younger and they're not married, there's a question of, are you common law married, which
Yeah.
is pretty interesting and a really tricky area of the law. So I won't really touch on it too much, but um, you know, I have people who say they've been with somebody for 10 years and they have no intention on getting married. And in fact, you know, they they might want all of their property to go to, a sibling or a parent instead of this other person, but that other person might not see things that way. So there are a lot of different ways that things can go, and um, it seems really simple,
Mhm.
on the outside,
Mhm.
um, but it doesn't always work out that way. And there are a lot of things that you just don't think about if you don't have those conversations with an attorney or with each other.
Mhm.
Um, so
I
I would
one
also add,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I will add something
Mhm.
that I've been thinking about a lot. One of the things that I did not talk about because it's so uncomfortable is, what my parents' estate plans were. And that
Mhm.
actually, especially after getting engaged and now being married, those are really things that can affect my husband. And likewise, his parents' estate plans, those will have an effect on me. I
Right.
guess this is a little personal, but my husband's uncle is disabled. So, for instance, we had conversations about what happens if something happens to your parents and
Right.
they're not able to be the guardian for your uncle anymore. Well, my husband would be the guardian. So those are things to talk about. You
Wow.
know, if you don't have other mechanisms in place to take care of your own parents, if something were to happen to them, then you and your spouse are going to be figuring things out on the fly. So it's kind of, those aren't things that you want to think about. No one wants to think about their parents getting older, but at the age that we are, that is the reality. And those are things that maybe it's not your estate plan necessarily, but certainly your parents and how their estate plan works out is going to affect you more than likely.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, the thing that comes to mind as I'm hearing you share all this, is just like how nuanced each and every situation and circumstance is going to be. I mean, because you think about, I mean, there's so many different scenarios, and especially when you start to add two people, but they have two parents, right? And those people have siblings, and so there's so many things that can impact, like, I mean, putting the deed to a house in someone's name can have a tremendous impact on their finances versus finding other vehicles, right? Like a trust or something to kind of make that transfer of the asset seamless. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot to consider. And I think you're right. I think that, one of the things that I hear talked about a lot in the personal finance space is that couples need to be having these like uncomfortable conversations. Like if there's debt, if there's shared assets, like what that's going to look like. Is it yours? Is it mine? Is it ours? How are we going to do that? um Parents' health, things like that. And then also, I mean, yeah, they're not very like attractive conversations to have, but they're necessary. So I really appreciate the insight that you've
Mhm.
offered. And, one of the things that, like, legally speaking, marriage is like it's like a whole thing, right? Like, I mean, I think a lot of people think we're in love, we're gonna get married, we're gonna unify and start a family, but like there's something that happens, right? Where like there's two single people and then legally they become married and then afterwards it's this other thing, right? They're like seen in a, I guess there's different scenarios. I'm curious, like, can you kind of walk me through like a step by step? So, I mean, like, say somebody is a single person and they got ahead of the game and they've got their estate planning in place, right? Their basic disability documents and like just a simple will, right? They're new in their career. They get married. Can you talk about like some of the things that they need to have in place before the marriage and then after the marriage? And then, yeah, just some things to consider because I think there are so many logistics that people don't really think about. And I'm curious from your perspective what you might have to share.
Yeah, so I mean, anytime you have a family or a big life event, so I include marriage, having kids, maybe family members that get, I hate to do the opposite of marriage, but divorced, or
Right.
um, family members pass away, family members get sick. All of these are really not wonderful sounding topics, but
Right.
anytime a major life event like that happens, you should definitely at least revisit your estate planning documents. And we actually even I go above and beyond that, and I say every 3 to 5 years, revisit doc your current documents if you have them, and make sure that circumstances, if they've changed, your documents are still doing what you would want them to do, and they still are appropriate for your current situation. Um, I think what's interesting is you kind of touched on the idea that once you're married, you're a unit, and I guess in the eyes of the law, you are more of a unit, especially in Texas. Because I don't know if you've talked about this on the podcast, but Texas is a community property state. What that means is, um, if you had property, like you mentioned, people who have accumulated a lot of wealth beforehand, that is their separate property. That the underlying asset might be separate, but if, for instance, you have been really diligent about saving and investing before you got married and you have this separate brokerage account, well, everything that you took into the marriage is separate property, but the income that comes off of that separate property is actually community property. So things can kind of get complicated, and your
Right.
property is commingled. You've got separate property and community property in one, big account. And that is really hard to go back and trace and say, this was mine, this is separate. So, a good idea would be to have a marital agreement, make it really clear. Your intentions could be that stays separate, or your intentions could be that you want to just go ahead and make it clear that you're converting that property to community property. And obviously, there are different reasons for doing one or the other, and those are definitely it's very nuanced, I would say, but that's a really good thing to think about if you have been investing before marriage.
Hmm. Yeah, it's super interesting. I'm thinking, yeah, because you're like talking about essentially like capital gains, right? Like the appreciation, like maybe like the equity on the house or the compounded interest on an investment, or maybe
So
even.
yeah, mainly the income. So let's say you have stocks, the dividends
Mhm,
that come from those investments,
mhm.
those would be community. So as they're paying dividends monthly, that's income that's generated from what was a separate property asset. That account is, if you can think about it as just one unit, would be separate property. But as you're generating more and more income, that income generated from a separate property is actually community property. So
Wow,
it
yeah,
gets really hard to go back and look and say, well, this was separate. Um,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, that sounds like it would be increasingly important to just consider, not necessarily like, well, yeah, consider and evaluate, right? Especially if there's like a wealth disparity with couples, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I mean, especially if they're like children from a previous marriage, right? Those that just like adds a layer, right? I think
Absolutely.
so, yeah, you mentioned Texas is a communal state, and we talked a little bit about like community property. And then, like, in terms of like family planning, and so like after the knot is tied, right? Say they signed a marital agreement. Can you talk about things that young couples and growing families might want to consider in terms of the welfare of their children and like as they age and grow their family, like what are some things they might want to consider in terms of being sure that all those things are looked after?
Yeah. So I kind of talked about this in the reverse, having look at your parents' estate plans. Make sure that they have things in order. Make sure that your spouse is comfortable with, you serving as your mom or your dad or somebody else in your family, you serving as their agent on power of attorney or medical power of attorney, because that is a lot of work, and or it can be a lot of work, and it might mean time taken away from your 9 to 5. Um, it also is it's just a big responsibility, and so it might be something that you want to talk to your spouse about and make sure that they know that you are named as an agent for somebody else. On the other side of that, when you're thinking about your own documents, definitely you want to think about who you would want to appoint and make sure that your spouse is on the same page with you. um, you know, your parents might not all get along, and your in-laws might think that they're going to be guardians of the children if something were to happen. And so just to make sure that things are not messy, if the worst case scenario happens to you and your spouse, that y'all have designated people, through a designation of guardian. And you can do that. That can be something that you do within your will, or you can do that separately. So it just depends on who your estate planning attorney is. There is a good reason to do that outside of your will, just in case you need to update those declarations more frequently. Um, maybe you don't want to have to change your entire will just to update that component. Um, but yeah, that is definitely something to think about. Um, Making sure that you and your spouse have thought through who's going to take care of things if something happens to you. So it's not necessarily about leaving your property to people. That is obviously a really big part of estate planning, but also just who's going to be there to help clean, keep things going, and take care of your kids. Who do you trust to handle the money that if you decide to leave everything to your children? Who do you trust to distribute that money and make sure that they're getting what they need? So those are some of the things that you would want to think about as a younger um, couple, or with minors. Really, anybody who has children under 18 should be thinking about those things.
Mm-hmm. Um, Two things that came to mind, which are a little off script, so hopefully I don't catch you too off guard. But can you talk a little bit about what couples might want to like think about? I know I always see Dave Ramsey talking about like the importance of life insurance, and like obviously you're not selling life insurance, but I mean for a younger couple, how important is that, and like retirement accounts and things like that. I feel like those are a little bit different, treated a little bit differently than like your checking account or a savings account or something like that. But I could be wrong. I'm curious, like what level of importance do you think those types of things have?
I think they're really important, and I think that they go hand in hand with thinking about your testamentary documents or your incapacity documents. Kind of obviously, there are so many different levels to the conversation when it comes to finance, and those are really important ones. We actually just talked to a financial advisor not too long ago, and one of the things that came up was paying for short term disability insurance.
Mhm.
Um, that is something that I had never thought about, and I if I don't have it through work, then that might be something that I should get, because if I'm out for maternity leave for 2 to 3 months, then that's something that I can at least continue to have my income. And I think that those are the things that you don't think about when you're sort of right when you're engaged. Those are just things that are not very fun to think about. But um, I would say that the conversation should just be never ending. I mean, we talk about it all the time. We try to talk to people who know more than us enough, and we try to do that together and separately so that we sort of have different perspectives, and that we've done our homework, I guess. So we try to be thorough. But I think the short term disability insurance is something that I'm actually really interested in, and just got brought up today. So I'm going to do
Mhm.
some more homework on that. And if anybody has any recommendations or thinks that it's a good idea, I would love to know.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you mentioned that. I was just introduced to short and long-term disability insurance. Again, these like are all things that people like don't really, it's not like super sexy to think about or anything like that. But I think in terms of
Yeah,
like
it's not at all.
it's like I guess that's kind of like somebody described this kind of stuff and compared it to like nuclear weapons. Like you don't ever want to have to use them, but like it's good to have. And I'm like, I don't know if that's the best analogy, but I mean, there's a lot of truth in that, like the message behind it. I think, it's like the again, the cost of being unprepared for these things. And I guess, yeah, like coming full circle, can you talk a little bit about like what what would the consequences essentially be if like basic things are not in place and something were to happen, like how does that process look? And can you talk a little bit about, how those things get decided when, there isn't the personal touch of working with an estate planning attorney?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess if I mean, the law is there um, to be, I guess, authoritative on this. And, but there are different ways that things can happen. I guess, shoot, we might have to erase.
Yeah, we got it.
So I guess first and foremost, the law is authoritative on some of these questions that you just raised, and there is a very clear cut formula. But where that formula kind of gets confusing is when there are other people involved that might have different perspectives. If you've, again, I'm going to go back to my example. If you've been living with somebody for 10 years and maybe
Wow.
you did intend to get married, or maybe y'all treated each other as husband and wife, but
Mhm.
if something happens and you have children from another person, um, you
Yeah.
know that can make things super messy, and
Wow.
especially depending on what kinds of assets that you and that common law spouse owned. It can be really hard for your children. It can be hard for other people involved, siblings, parents. Just kind of depends on the actual facts. But I think a lot of people who are young, they really do think, oh, okay, well, the law says that if I die and I'm single, all of my property is going to my parents. But again, you just don't know what can happen if you do have a long-term partner or somebody that you
Mhm.
live with. It can get really confusing. I think it's just really good for your family to have everything clear and in writing. This is the person that is going to take care of things if something bad happens to me. This is
Mhm.
the person who I'm going to leave my, you know, wedding ring to, or
Right.
whatever other piece of property, or actually, I would like for my mom to be able to have my house and continue to live in it, or I would like for my mom and brother to sell my house and split the proceeds. I mean, there are so many different things that you just don't think about. Um, it also is interesting if you don't put things, sometimes when you don't have things in writing, you don't notice how, the issues of having them in writing. For example, under the law, when I was single, if all my property goes to my parents are divorced. I am pretty sure that my divorced parents don't want to co-own a house together.
Wow.
So there are different ways that things can just
Yeah.
get so messy, and you don't realize it until you see in
Interesting.
writing,
Wow.
how things are going to work out, and then you're able to adjust.
Well, I think that's one of the beautiful parts of working with an attorney, right? Is that they are going to be able to kind of guide each and every circumstance through that process. That you guys deal with this every day, and so I feel really really grateful that we get to have this conversation. Number one, and number two, I'm curious, like, I guess what would be like your, like, not just professional, right? Like, what would be your one like nugget of wisdom to leave anybody who, like, on a personal level too, in a way, right? Because you just were married and like went through a major life change, but you also do this for a living. Like, anybody who's about to embark on these like major life transitions, like we're describing, what is your biggest takeaway that you're hoping they get from this episode?
Talk about things frequently.
Yeah.
then, I mean, I really just, I would not have known some of the things if we hadn't had so many conversations. And sometimes it seems like you're just going over the same topic, but
Great.
different you learn different things every time you have that conversation, or you think about new things that you would like to talk about and like to figure out. I think for me, like, just figuring out how different like figuring out how our parents' lives can affect us. Um, you know, I
Yeah.
might not want my in-laws living with me if something happens to them.
Right.
So it might be a good idea for my husband and I to start kind of saving and saying, okay, like, this is how we're gonna care for them if something happens. Things like that. I mean, those are just not things that you think about right before you're engaged and then married. And even before that, there's just so many. I think it's so important to continue to have these conversations. Jennifer, you've given me a run for my money today. I'm thinking about things that I was not thinking about before we had this conversation. So I hope that
Oh my
some
gosh.
of my thoughts are clear. Because yeah, I just think, that's the only way to learn and to develop and really evaluate also your situation is to just have conversations.
I love that. And we'll wrap up, but one last comment. My significant other and I, we're at that point where we're ready to take the next steps forward soon. And he and I are both only children, so it gets really interesting when it comes to our parents. And thankfully, we've had lots of conversations, but I know you and I have talked about working together. So I'm definitely going to be calling you in the next few months here, especially as things start to gain a little bit more momentum. I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart so much for taking some time out of your schedule and your life to come on the podcast and share your insight and your wisdom and knowledge and experience with the audience. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. It was a pleasure. And thank you for kind of running me through this process. Again, first time to do this.
Yeah,
So definitely a little camera shy, but maybe this was a great experience and you made it really easy. And I, I wish you the best of luck.
thank
And
you.
I will also talk to you outside of this too,
Yeah.
because love keeping up with you.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited. And for those of you listening and are hoping to tune in next week, I have a old friend of probably 10 years, Matt Russin, is going to come on. He is really knowledgeable about cryptocurrency. And so we're going to talk about that as well as artificial intelligence. So be sure to tune in next Wednesday at 10 a.m. And I hope you all have a wonderful week.
Thanks, Jennifer.